distinguished guests, Sireli Hayranagitsner. Some of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be difficult to hear. Some of it may be difficult to digest. Some of it may be difficult even to believe. But if there's one thing that I can assure each of you, it is that everything we are going to discuss today is true. It's painfully true. It's disgustingly true. This is unquestionably one of the most dire moments in recent Armenian history. A moment of existential threat, of torment, of trauma, of injustice and indignity. It's a moment that delivers us back to a collective memory of unresolved injustice, and at the same time pushes us forward into an ominous uncertainty. The depravity is cemented. It's cemented in my mind, and it's cemented in many of your minds too. I am absolutely certain of it. The images of an old Armenian man struggling on his back in the grass and weeds as his head is being sawed off with a serrated-edged military dagger. Armenian captives crawling on their hands and knees, being prodded like animals by Azerbaijani soldiers with metal pipes. A stamp issued by an actual government depicting an exterminator in a hazmat suit cleansing Nagorno-Karabakh of Armenians. A military trophy park in Baku showcasing the helmets of fallen Armenian soldiers, gruesome and bloody mannequins of Armenians, displayed in a public park for Azerbaijani children to mock and degrade. The president of a state in this century, a century after the genocide, referring to Armenians, to many of us, as dogs. This is not never again. This is not never again at all. Armenian POWs bound and brought to their knees, and Azerbaijani soldiers in sickened euphoria unloading bullet after bullet after bullet into the heads and backs of young Armenian boys, teenagers, boys barely in their 20s. Then actually circulating a video on social media. What is that? A grotesque victory lap? And it doesn't stop. Her body was mutilated, Turkish words chiseled into her bare chest, her eyes gouged out, stones jammed into her eye sockets in their place, her fingers chopped off and shoved into her mouth. A young Armenian mother, not much older than many of you here. Coexistence and integration as a solution to the Artsakh question? It shocks me when policymakers and think tanks in Europe and even in Washington, and frighteningly, even in Yerevan, suggest that the best outcome for Nagorno-Karabakh would be some sort of protected status within Azerbaijan. Really? Placing Armenians under the control and authority of Azerbaijan right at the time when Genocide Watch has raised the genocide threat level facing Artsakh Armenians to levels 9 and 10, when the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention has warned that Azerbaijan's actions, and I'm quoting here, are part of a larger genocidal pattern demonstrating Azerbaijan's Armenophobia and genocidal intent aimed at the eradication of Armenia, Artsakh, and the Armenians. In this documented reality, the solution being pandered by sophisticated parties is actually placing Artsakh Armenians within Azerbaijan. That's a workable solution for the fate of actual human beings? Integration when 120,000 Armenians remain under total blockade by Azerbaijan now for more than 4 months? when Azerbaijan has orchestrated a pattern of measures unquestionably aimed at rendering living conditions unbearable for human beings, cutting off gas, severing electricity lines, blocking humanitarian aid, sabotaging internet connections, and its links to the outside world. Coexistence, where Azerbaijan is seeking to completely isolate and encircle Nagorno-Karabakh. That we even allow this narrative is appalling. We would never, ever imagine subjecting a population of 120,000 Jews to the authority of a rabid Nazi regime, or any Nazi regime for that matter. Let's give it another try? That would not only be utterly ridiculous, it is patently inhumane, intellectually vapid, morally bankrupt, and it's disgusting to even imagine. The same is true here. You know, there's a reason why Armenians have a natural aversion to the thought of subjecting Armenians to the authority of the Baku regime. Actually, there are a number of reasons. Sumgait, Kirovabad, Maraga, Nakhichevan. There's also Ramil Safarov. You may remember him. The Azerbaijani military officer participating in a NATO peace program in Hungary, who broke into the dorm room of an Armenian soldier in the middle of the night and then hacked the young Armenian to death in his sleep with an axe before turning around to hunt his Armenian roommate. Ramil Safarov is not crazy. Ramil Safarov is cultivated. He's a fascist murderer specifically cultivated by the Baku regime. He is a celebrated hero today in Azerbaijan. Aliyev extradited him from Hungary, where he had been convicted of murder, welcomed him back to Baku with a bouquet of roses, and not only set him free, but awarded him medals, an apartment, and even back pay for his time incarcerated in Budapest. Let's not fool ourselves. We're facing an authoritarian dictatorship committed to destroying the Armenian people. And that's not hyperbole. Ilham Aliyev said it himself. "We will destroy you," he told the Armenian Prime Minister. Just this past September, Aliyev announced the creation of the Goycha Zangezur Republic, a new republic spanning from Gyumri to Sunik in Armenia itself. The new country even opened a representative office in Ankara, with Erdogan's blessing, of course. And before you laugh it off as something silly, think about this. Azerbaijani soldiers carry maps of this new republic in their pockets, and Yerevan itself is on those maps. Unrealistic, you think? Just last week, Azerbaijani soldiers were wandering around Sunik, crowing about having executed and mutilated Armenian boys. And just in case we missed the connection, I'd like to remind you that just 2 years ago, the Turkish president stood next to Aliyev at a military parade in Baku and openly praised Nuri Pasha, the Ottoman leader who executed the eastern flank of the Armenian genocide a century ago. The message is clear, at least to us. So what have we missed? How have we allowed this narrative of coexistence, this idea that Artsakh Armenians can somehow just be part of Azerbaijan as a minority with security guarantees? How have we allowed that to even be entertained by the West? How have we allowed the minority rights narrative to grab hold, while the narrative of Artsakh self-determination has been neglected as unrealistic or the talk of nationalists? How is it that Europe today can tell Armenia, and this is their words, to lower the bar on Artsakh and speak about the Artsakh Armenians from the perspective of minority rights, not as a people with the right to self-determination? How in the world did we get here? And it's not just about power politics. It's not simply might makes right. It's not simply the Azerbaijani lobby or caviar diplomacy. You know, we Armenians for more than a century and for far too long have consoled ourselves with the idea that things are beyond our power, that big powers dictate, and we just must simply conform ourselves to the outcomes. That's a cop-out. It's intellectually lazy. Saying it's all about power politics is like saying that suffering a heart attack is just about genetics, that nothing else plays a role. We know that's not right. Brute force and power have their place, sure. But we know the international world order is a bit more complicated than that. The truth is that states set policies, define interests, and seek outcomes based on narratives, stories of how they want to see the world, stories of democracy, of free trade, development. You know the themes. There are also narratives that Western states fight against: dictatorship, authoritarianism, fascism, hatred, discrimination. So the way we tell our story, the language we use to tell our story matters. And it turns out it matters a whole lot. How does our story fit within these prevailing narratives? How do we tell the story the right way? The stories we tell others, even the stories that we tell ourselves, shape the thinking of interest groups, think tanks, and capitals, and they're part of the conversations at negotiation tables, and even in the kitchens and the living rooms of world leaders. How you tell the story matters, sometimes more than the story itself. And in the world order, in the games played by states in war and peace, international law is one of these storytelling tools. It is one of the ways that states set their narratives in this global world order. It's how states tell other states their stories of what the world should look like and what the world should not look like. And I don't believe that we're powerless in this game, not at all. We have a role in contributing to the development of these international legal narratives. It's our obligation to tell our story in a way that fits into the themes that states and their leaders actually care about. No one's going to do that for us. It's our job to tell our story the right way. So while we endure the atrocities of war crimes, the unending struggle of sovereignty and statehood, the painful trials of human rights, we must bring ourselves to peer out of this repulsive pit and try, if even for a moment, to tell our story, not in tears and resignation, but in the language that the world speaks when they speak about the international world order. And in doing so, we will see that the very concepts, the very legal principles that underpin our own existential uncertainties, our human rights struggles, and even the very atrocities that I just spoke of, those very legal principles are themselves in a state of monumental flux right now. The scope of war crimes and even the definition of genocide has expanded in our lifetimes. The idea of cultural genocide did not even exist a century ago when Armenian churches, cemeteries, and schools were being ransacked, looted, and desecrated. The term ethnic cleansing did not exist when my ancestors and those of others here were being driven from their homes and herded into the Syrian desert. Today it has a definition under international law: the systematic forced removal of ethnic, racial, religious groups from a given area. And along with direct removal, extermination, or deportation, ethnic cleansing even includes indirect methods. Methods aimed at forced migration, like rendering living conditions so severe, so austere, as to coerce a people to leave and not return. That should sound familiar, especially as Azerbaijan's total blockade of Artsakh enters its 132nd day. We must connect those dots. Nobody's going to do that for us. The concept of sovereignty itself has never been as fashionable as a subject as it is right now. Today, the principle of sovereignty underpins the discourse of military confrontation in Europe, the narratives of economic sanctions pitting East against West, the limits of cyber warfare, and the idea of sovereignty, the question of sovereignty, grips Armenia by the jugular. Even the principle of self-determination has literally transformed in our lifetimes. It's no longer the simple tool of decolonization. Within the last 3 decades alone, the United States, NATO, Russia, Europe, and Africa have all spoken and acted in its name, and at the most consequential times in their own histories. In fact, self-determination is how the number of states in the United Nations grew from 60 in 1950 to more than 190 today. Self-determination is not dead. Self-determination is an expanding right at international law, richer today than it has ever been before. And of course, it is one of the essential themes that will define one of the most uncertain and perilous corners of the Armenian experience today, Artsakh. So, how does our story actually fit in this constantly evolving legal framework? And what does a century-old genocide have to teach us in this regard? How do we tell the story of Artsakh, define the future of Artsakh, consistent with these legal narratives, the ones that matter? On the one hand, there are those fundamental facts. Artsakh was never part of any independent Azerbaijani state. Let's get that out of the way. During the Soviet period, the sovereign state was the Soviet Union, not the Azerbaijani SSR. Artsakh seceded from the Soviet Union, the sovereign state, consistent with the Soviet law on secession. Azerbaijan knows this law very well. It used the same law when declaring its own independence. But you see, Azerbaijan writes that story right out of the books. And the West, especially Europe, is all too eager to help it do it. It openly pressures Yerevan to accept Artsakh as part of Azerbaijan. Don't worry, it's telling Yerevan. We'll make sure that the Artsakh Armenians have security guarantees, perhaps even a protected status within Azerbaijan. This is a colossal sham. It's a false narrative. Europe is purposely turning the law of self-determination flat on its head in order to placate Azerbaijan. What Europe is doing is insulting. It is treacherous. And if this deceitful narrative is allowed to continue, humans will suffer the unspeakable. I want to explain this game because it's important. Self-determination today comes in two accepted variants. Internal self-determination, this idea that of a protected status within a state, and external self-determination, an independent status separate from the state. The rule as to whether internal or external self-determination applies has become established in the 3 decades since Artsakh's declaration of independence in 1991. The idea of internal self-determination is best exemplified by the case of Quebec. As many of you know, Quebec exercised the right of self-determination and sought to secede from Canada in the mid-1990s. Quebec wanted to be independent of Canada, noting its distinct French language, its culture, its linguistic differences, its religious and historical ties to France. It was culturally, linguistically, and historically unique, different than the rest of Canada. Quebec wanted independence. Now, what's absolutely important to remember is that when Quebec exercised its right to self-determination, the Canadian Army was not assembled at the gates of Montreal with weapons, tanks, and soldiers clamoring to exterminate the Québécois or force them into the Atlantic. In fact, at no point during the Quebec secessionist movement did the Canadian government seek to exterminate the people of Quebec, to destroy their churches, scrape away the French language from the buildings, to chase the Québécois out of Quebec like dogs. Remember this. When the case reached the Canadian Supreme Court, the outcome was clear. Quebec did not have the right to secede from Canada. In other words, it did not have the right to external self-determination. The Canadian Supreme Court specifically held that the need to protect Quebec's cultural, linguistic, and religious character could be realized through internal self-determination, a protected status within Canada. It reasoned, Canada is a multi-ethnic state. The democratic and constitutional guarantees provided by Canada could encompass and protect these cultural and linguistic preferences. Internal self-determination in the Canadian context would not open the door to the ethnic cleansing or genocide of the Québécois. The context here, of course, is profoundly different. Azerbaijan has already engaged and is actively engaged right now in the ethnic cleansing of the Artsakh Armenians. The blockade itself is proof of that campaign. The Azerbaijani president, parliamentarians, many prominent cultural figures openly espouse hatred, dehumanization, removal and extermination of the Artsakh Armenians. Armenophobia has been intentionally and strategically institutionalized in Azerbaijani society. The backstory is unavoidable too. Azerbaijan has already ethnically cleansed Armenians from every city that has fallen under its authority and control. There are no more Armenians in Baku, Sumgait, Kirovabad, Nakhichevan, and since 2020, there are none in Shushi or Hadrut either. And there's more. Azerbaijan even labors to cleanse the land itself of any evidence of Armenians, destroying Armenian churches, unearthing entire Armenian cemeteries, scraping away ancient Armenian biblical inscriptions, and claiming that the Armenian churches are actually Albanian churches. Just 4 months ago, the Azerbaijani ambassador actually told the United Nations Security Council that even the word Nagorno-Karabakh does not exist anymore. The Azerbaijanis said the same thing, the Azerbaijani president, just a month ago. Imagine now, for a moment, a Canadian ambassador telling the United Nations Security Council that the word Quebec does not exist anymore. Justin Trudeau saying that the word Quebec does not exist. The Quebec model, this protected status within another state, may work in the Great White North, but it doesn't fit the facts here. Azerbaijan is not Canada. Azerbaijan right now is holding Artsakh Armenians, including women, children, the disabled, and the elderly, hostage in a total blockade that is targeting and starving actual human beings in complete isolation and utter darkness. What comes next has played out like clockwork, from the Armenian genocide to the Holocaust, from the Rohingyas to Darfur, and from Cambodia to Kosovo. And this is where international law gets interesting. It turns out that in the face of ethnic cleansing and the risk of genocide, which is clearly what we have here, it is external self-determination that is legally required. This was not always the case, but international law, like law generally, is a constantly evolving body of norms. External self-determination in the face of ethnic cleansing or genocide is the Kosovo variant. It is what the West, led by the United States and NATO, demanded in the Kosovo crisis. That recognition of Kosovo's right to self-determination and the independence of Kosovo as outside Serbia was necessary to prevent ethnic cleansing and genocide. That case went to the International Court of Justice. The court rendered a decision which underpinned the recognition of Kosovo's independent statehood outside of Serbia. And the decision is quite revealing. The court actually identified what triggers external self-determination. The court held, and I'm going to quote it here, "The international law of self-determination has developed in such a way as to create a right of independence for peoples subject to alien subjugation, domination, and exploitation." The court recognized that when external self-determination is appropriate, when the people faces subjugation, domination, and exploitation. And this makes a lot of sense. When a people faces ethnic cleansing and genocide, the solution cannot be to push those people into the authority and control of the state seeking to exterminate them. That would be absurd. Fast forward to the blockade of that distant mountain road. There's no question that Artsakh Armenians stand before a cliff of death or displacement. Under international law, this is precisely where external self-determination is triggered. International law provides external self-determination as a final stopgap measure to prevent ethnic cleansing and genocide, to prevent mass death and displacement. External self-determination is the proper step here. Anything else is empty semantics, uninformed naivete, or simply the green lighting of ethnic cleansing and the extermination of a people. Again, you know, while ancient and storied, the Armenian nation is a living nation. We are a living nation with stories yet to tell and epics yet to write. We must recognize, especially as we commemorate the genocide today, that Artsakh is the heart of that living nation. It's the place where Mesrop Mashtots over 1,600 years ago created our alphabet, and the place that 35 years ago sparked the Armenian independence movement itself. But most importantly, Artsakh is the place where 120,000 of our people, our Armenian people, stand on their native land against all odds, surrounded by Azerbaijani forces intent on their elimination. Artsakh is our story, and many of you know this story. It's the story of Van, it's the story of Musaler, it's the story of Armenian national dignity in the face of conquest and subjugation. Allowing the free-fall collapse of the foundational pillar of the Armenian nation will have irreparable consequences, and I'm going to assure you that peace is not one of them. It will only embolden the fascist upstart in Baku, one who has thrived in a distracted world order, to finish the horrendous objective that every leading human rights organization, from Amnesty International to the International Association of Genocide Scholars, has red flagged as underway. Genocide is not simply what happened to us. It is what is happening to us now. Ethnic cleansing against the Armenian people is sport. It's been a sport for nearly 2 centuries. The genocide was simply its Super Bowl. And make no mistake, this is what impunity tastes like. As my colleague Garo Ghazarian said to me in Shushi during one of our many working trips there, narratives matter. Stories matter. They are powerful and they change realities. Getting the self-determination story right paves the way towards genuine security and peace in a manner consistent with the ideals and principles upon which a law-based world order should be founded. Getting the self-determination story wrong only opens the door to abject subjugation, policies that will exacerbate the conflict inhumanely and quite literally lead human beings to their slaughter. There are no security guarantees and no protected status that can mask the lingering odor of genocide committed, that revolting smell of genocide left unpunished, and that sickening stench of genocide pounding and pushing at the gates. Artsakh is Kosovo, not Quebec. Understanding this and insisting upon this may be just enough and just in time to prevent another ungodly and gruesome chapter in our recent human history. Thank you.